I would like to leave to Hannah to introduce Professor Cassam, and then after his lecture, we will continue with Nenad's, so this session after all. So Hannah, please, take it.
Thank you, Snezhana. So we all know who Cassam is. He's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Warwick and the author of 6 books on a range of subjects, including Self-Knowledge for Humans, Perception, Intellectual Vices, which is his great new book, Vices of the Mind, and Conspiracy Theories. His current research is on epistemic vices, the post-truth era, extremism, the philosophy of terrorism, and the philosophy of general practice. And he's currently writing a forthcoming book called Extremism, a Philosophical Analysis. And today he will be speaking about sense-making in democratic politics. So Cassam, I leave the floor to you.
Well, thanks very much, and sorry for the delay. I've just been dealing with a family crisis, but I'm here now. So the topic of my talk, I mean, it really goes back to 2016 and the shock that many people on the liberal side of politics felt at the election of Trump. And even in the recent election, large numbers of Americans voted for Trump. In the UK, large numbers of people voted for Brexit, and in other places in Europe, large numbers of people seem to be voting for things that people on the liberal side of politics not only disapprove of, but find it very hard to understand even. These are things that have been on my mind, and I think on the minds perhaps of many of you as well. And then I came across a passage in a book by Jason Stanley. This is Jason Stanley's propaganda book. So I'm going to share the screen with you so that you can see the passage. So in the book, Stanley says, democratic culture is one in which citizens have good reasons for acting as they do. It involves, for example, questioning one's own perspective if one cannot make rational sense out of the actions of one's fellow citizens. Now, that's a very striking passage in lots of ways. And the question that really prompted me to write this lecture was the question, what is the relevance of this recommendation of Stanley's for our understanding of these people that I've just been talking about, whose political actions seem very hard to understand, and which I think many people on the liberal side of politics feel make no sense at all. So when I talk about making rational sense of the actions and preferences of one's fellow citizens, I'm going to call that sense making. Okay, so sense making is the activity, the project of trying to make sense of the actions and preferences of one's fellow citizens, and in particular, the actions and preferences of those of one's fellow citizens that one has little in common with, politically speaking. So that's what I mean by sense making. And sense making really comes into its own, it really becomes relevant when one's fellow citizens act in ways that are prima facie surprising or eccentric or self-defeating. The thought I want to explore in this talk is I want to basically do two things. Well, maybe three things. I wanted to explain to you what sense making is. I'm interested in explaining to you why we should do it. And the last thing is looking at possible obstacles to sense making or arguments against doing it. So I see sense making as an antidote to what I call the blind spot. And the blind spot is just this inability to comprehend the behavior and choices of large numbers of one's fellow citizens. And of course, part of the problem that we face now with the problem of polarization is that people on both sides of the political divide have this blind spot. Neither side is able to comprehend the behavior and choices of the other side. And of course, that's part of the polarization problem. So here then are three questions. Why is sense-making necessary or desirable in a democratic culture? I mean, why should we do it? I mean, someone might read Stanley's principle and say, well, why should I assume that other people have good reasons for their actions? Why should I assume that their preferences make rational sense? So that's the first question. What is the case for sense making in a democratic culture? The second question is, what is involved in sense making? What is involved in making rational sense of the actions of one's fellow citizens? So this is really a question about the methodology of sense making. And the third question is a question about the limits of sense making. Are there circumstances in which sense making is inappropriate? So if you go back to the 2016 American election, you might remember that Hillary Clinton famously referred to many of Donald Trump's supporters as the deplorables, a basket of deplorables. One way of taking that is to say, look, when you're confronted by people like that, when you're confronted by the sorts of people who stormed the Capitol a few weeks ago, it's not our job to try to make sense of them. Right? I mean, we need to fight against them, we need to stop them, but sense making isn't an appropriate response when faced with that sort of conduct. So these are the three issues that I want to talk about, and just to make it completely clear how this bears on Stanley's quote. So 74 million Americans voted for Trump, even in the recent election, which he lost, but still large numbers of Americans voted for him. So the obvious question is, does Stanley's principle require us to suppose that those who voted for Trump had good reasons for doing so? Just to remind you, right? So a democratic culture is one in which citizens assume that their fellow citizens have good reasons for acting as they do. Good reasons. Okay, so does this principle require us to suppose that 74 million Americans who voted for Trump had good reason for doing so? Now, I know from a conversation with Jason that his answer to this is to say, look, that's a ridiculous question because America doesn't have a democratic culture, right? So the sense-making principle doesn't apply in the US context. Now, that seems to me to be a rather easy way out of this problem. I mean, I think there is surely some sense in which the political culture of the United States can still, even today, be described as democratic. And even if you think it isn't a democratic political culture, you can still ask the question whether we should be trying to engage in sense making anyway. So that's the last point on the slide. Even if the political culture of the United States isn't democratic, isn't there still good reason to engage in sense making? Isn't there still good reason for trying to make rational sense, or at least sense, of the actions of Trump voters? So what are these reasons? I mean, why should we engage in this activity? So I want to put forward or consider two arguments for sense making. So here's why sense making makes sense. The first argument is a pragmatic argument. The pragmatic argument is that in order to gain political power and appeal to the electorate as a whole, it is actually quite important that one understands why large numbers of one's fellow citizens make the decisions that they do. If you're in the business of trying to convince them, or if you're in the business of trying to develop counter arguments or counter strategies, the starting point needs to be some understanding of why these people are acting as they do. So again, in the context of the United States, if you think about the rise of the far right, you think about the people who demonstrated at the Capitol. However repellent they might seem to us, they certainly seem repellent to me, just from a kind of pragmatic angle, it would be very, very helpful to, as it were, understand where these people are coming from. And what is it that's driving them? What is it that's motivating them? What is their story? What's their story, right, is the question. And unless we have an answer to these questions, unless we can actually understand, at least to some extent, what these people are up to, it's going to be very hard to develop counter strategies. And certainly, if you're thinking ahead to the next presidential election in 2024 in the US, I mean, clearly people on the Democratic side need to actually make an effort to figure out what, if anything, they can do just to persuade or in some other way to influence the sorts of people who backed and continue to back Trump. You can't, just from a pragmatic point of view, just write them off. The second argument for sense making is an ethical argument. Now, the ethical argument is one that is trickier in some ways, and the argument simply is that at least in a democracy, and perhaps in any political arrangement, there is a kind of moral obligation to try to make sense of one's fellow citizens. I mean, the alternative to doing that is what is the alternative? I mean, what is the alternative? Well, of course, the alternative would be to say these people are deplorable. These people are beyond the pale. These people are people whose views we cannot understand. And not only can we not understand their views, we shouldn't even be trying to understand them. These people are not even in the space of reasons. Now, to say all these things about one's fellow citizens is to engage in what I call othering. So let me just talk about othering. So othering is the attribution of relative inferiority and or radical alienness to some other or other outgroup. Now, I think othering is a really fundamental notion. And othering, I think, is something that goes on all the time, and it's the idea that some people are so strange and so far from the norm that there is really no hope of trying to make rational sense of them. These people are really they're political aliens, and that carries with it, of course, some implication of inferiority. So I'm drawing a contrast between sense-making and othering. To engage in sense-making is precisely not to engage in othering. To engage in sense-making is actually to try to make rational sense of the other, and not to simply dismiss the other as radically alien and beyond the pale. Now, of course, I mean, you might say, well, what's wrong with othering? Aren't there cases in which othering is perfectly appropriate? And that's something that maybe we need to talk about in discussion. But I would want to maintain that large-scale othering is not only foolish, pragmatically speaking, but is also ethically suspect. Another notion that I think is very helpful in this connection is one that Jose Medina characterizes in his book on the epistemology of resistance, where he talks about the notion of insensitivity. So insensitivity consists in being cognitively and affectively numbed to the lives of others, being inattentive to and unconcerned by their experiences, problems, and aspirations, and being unable to connect with them and to understand their speech and action. Now, I think that when one is confronted by these very strange characters who we saw storming the Capitol, I mean, the man with the funny horns on his head and covered in tattoos and carrying Trump paraphernalia. I don't know about you, but when I look at these people on on the news, I mean, it's very hard to stop oneself thinking, I mean, who are these people? What on earth are they thinking? What on earth is driving them? And it's quite easy to be inattentive to and unconcerned by their experiences, problems, and aspirations, and to just give up on the project of trying to connect with them, on the project of trying to understand their speech and action. And of course, one of the things that makes othering very easy, one of the things that makes insensitivity very easy is what I like to think of as the problem of other lives. I mean, in philosophy, we're very familiar with the problem of other minds, but I think the problem of other lives is worth reflecting on. And when I talk about the problem of other lives, I'm talking about the problem of connecting with and making sense of lives that are fundamentally different from our own. Where that includes making sense of values, practices, rituals, background assumptions, and so on, that are very different. Okay, so that's sense making then, as I see it, is an antidote to othering and insensitivity. It's a kind of response to the problem of other lives. So the idea is that making sense of the political preferences and conduct of people that one finds so hard to understand on the face of it is partly a matter of making sense of their lives, of connecting with their lives as the source of their values and of their political behavior. Okay, so I've now given you two sorts of reason for engaging in sense making, the pragmatic and the ethical, and I've contrasted sense making with othering and insensitivity. So the next question is, how do we do it? How is sense making even possible? Is it possible? So I want to look at three possible sense making tools. The first is empathy. The second is radical interpretation, and the third is what I call narrative reconstruction. Now, all of these, I think, are useful ways of engaging in sense making. The one that I think has received the most attention in the last few years is empathy, and in my opinion, it's received far too much attention. So certainly, again, sorry to be going on about the US context, but this is very much on my mind at the moment. So one of the things that President Obama said that a few years ago was that the biggest problem facing America was not the fiscal deficit. The biggest problem was what he called the empathy deficit. The fact that neither side of the political divide had any empathy for the other side. A couple of years ago, Hillary Clinton published a book called What Happened, which was her analysis of her failure to defeat Trump in 2016. And the book recommends what she calls radical empathy as a means of connecting with and making sense of one's political opponents. And I'll read you a passage from Clinton's book. I mean, this is where she's really wrestling with this problem of empathy. And she asked the question, do I feel empathy for Trump's voters? And she says, that's a question I've asked myself a lot, and it's complicated. And she says something that I think many people will feel when she says, I look at the people at Trump's rallies cheering for his hateful rants, and I wonder, where's their empathy? Where's their understanding? Why are they allowed to close their hearts to the striving immigrant father and the grieving black mother, or the teenager who's bullied at school and thinking of suicide? Why is the burden of opening our hearts only on half the country? And then she says, and yet I've come to believe that for me personally and for our country generally, we have no choice but to try. So she's clearly wrestling with the problem of why on earth should we try to empathize with people who themselves have no empathy, seemingly? And she concludes that this is something that we nevertheless need to do. Now, of course, the notion of empathy is extremely tricky and can be understood in many different ways. Of course, there's the familiar distinction between emotional and cognitive empathy. So, to put it crudely, with emotional empathy, you try to put yourself in other people's shoes in such a way as to feel or experience what they experience. So, the classic expression of emotional empathy is "I feel your pain." Cognitive empathy, in contrast, is not a matter of feeling what other people feel. It's simply a matter of knowing or discovering what they feel. It's not a matter of emotion. It's a matter of something that's more intellectual. Now, as I say, there are many different ways of understanding these various ideas. And I want to suggest that emotional empathy is not necessary for the sense-making project of uncovering the reasons for which people act as they do. I mean, if the object of the exercise is to uncover the reasons for which people voted for Trump or voted for Brexit or voted for whatever you disapprove of, it's not clear to me that emotional empathy, feeling their pain, is necessarily going to be hugely illuminating. What we need, if we're trying to uncover other people's reasons, is cognitive empathy. But cognitive empathy is just a label for what we're trying to explain. I mean, saying that cognitive empathy is a sense-making tool doesn't really get you very far, because cognitive empathy just is the project of uncovering other people's states of mind. So I don't rule out empathy as being completely useless, but I am somewhat skeptical about all this empathy talk that has become increasingly prevalent, as if we can solve political problems through empathy. A second sense-making tool is radical interpretation. Now, when I talk about radical interpretation, I'm really talking about the work of Donald Davidson. I don't know if people read Davidson anymore. When I was a grad student, people only read Davidson. So Davidson says a couple of things which are elaborations of the famous Davidsonian principle of charity. Now, of course, Davidson is not at all concerned with politics here, but it's interesting to look at these Davidson quotations in the light of some of the political issues and considerations that I've been talking about. So Davidson says, making sense of the utterances and behavior of others, even their most aberrant behavior, requires us to find a great deal of reason and truth in them. So that's a very striking claim. Right? So think about whether or how this would apply in the context of political interpretation or political explanation. Are we required to find a great deal of reason and truth in the utterances and behavior of our political opponents, for example? Now, of course, Davidson is operating at a much higher level of abstraction when he talks about finding reason and truth. I mean, he's not talking about the political context, he's talking about something much more general, but I think it is an interesting question whether these sorts of principles apply in the political realm. Then you have the principle of charity. Now, the principle of charity says that if we cannot find a way to interpret the utterances and behavior of a creature as revealing a set of beliefs largely consistent and true by our own standards, we have no reason to count the creature as rational, as having beliefs, or saying anything at all. Now, the important point there is that interpretation in the Davidsonian sense is guided by this principle, the principle of charity, which is the principle of revealing the utterances and behavior of the interpretee as not only internally consistent, but true by our standards. Now, in the political realm, of course, this seems a very odd principle to apply, because it requires you to proceed on the basis that the political utterances and behavior of others are largely consistent and true by our standards. And I don't see that as a sense-making requirement either. It's perfectly possible to make sense of other people's political preferences and choices and outlooks without assuming that their political beliefs are true by our standards. Indeed, it might be completely obvious to us that their political beliefs are false by our standards. But that still leaves us with the task of making sense of those beliefs and making sense of those preferences. So I think it is worth at least reflecting on this Davidsonian perspective and thinking about whether it is helpful in a political context. It wasn't designed for that. And I'm inclined to think that although there's something in what Davidson says, I mean, there's certainly something in the idea of looking for reason and truth in political interpretation. The problem that we face quite often, I think, is that we are not going to find certainly much truth by our own standards in these cases. So we seem to be stuck. I mean, we seem to have these two stories about how sense-making proceeds, how sense-making is possible. I think both the empathy story and the radical interpretation story are interesting, and they're worth reflecting on, but I don't think that they really give us what we are looking for. So what do we do in that case? What does sense-making involve, and how can we do better? So I want to introduce the idea of a narrative. So this is what I think is a key notion for sense-making. So let me just first of all start off by spelling out the notion of a narrative. So here's a definition from Lawrence Friedman. Narratives are compelling storylines which explain events convincingly and from which inferences can be drawn. Now, narratives, I would argue, are absolutely fundamental to human life in general. Each of us has a narrative about their own life. Each of us operates with an implicit political narrative. We operate with an implicit economic narrative, and so on. So narratives are stories, they might be myths even, which purport to provide explanations of some aspect of life or society. And these are stories that provide the basis for further inferences. So an example of a narrative in the political domain is, of course, a conspiracy theory. So conspiracy theories are narratives. They are stories about what supposedly really happened with some incident. So here's another quotation about narratives. Narratives are about the ways that issues are framed and responses suggested. They are not necessarily analytical, and when not grounded in evidence or experience, may rely on appeal to emotion or on suspect metaphors and dubious historical analogies. So just to notice there that Friedman is not saying that narratives can't be grounded in evidence. He's not saying that narratives can't be grounded in experience. What he's saying is that they aren't necessarily grounded in evidence or experience. They aren't necessarily analytical. I mean, we shouldn't think of narratives as kind of scientific theories. Narratives are stories above all, and part of what makes narratives effective is that they are stories that their audiences find compelling in some way, and their compellingness is in turn a function of the way that these narratives plug into their audiences' emotions and perhaps their values as well. So that's what I mean by a narrative. And I now want to, in the light of that, make a suggestion about sense making in the light of this discussion. So here's the basic idea. Making sense of prima facie surprising or eccentric or self-defeating choices or actions requires the reconstruction of the narratives by which these choices or actions are underpinned. Okay, so I'm making an assumption here. So I'm making the assumption that political choices and actions are underpinned by narratives. And if you want to understand these choices, you need to understand the narrative. So let me give you a non-American example. This is a British example. If you're thinking about support for Brexit in the UK in 2016, I mean, of course, you know, there were arguments about the impact of Brexit on the British economy, and the impact on trade and impact on sovereignty and so on and so forth. And of course, those sorts of arguments certainly had some impact on the Brexit debate. But above all, I think, the thing that is really striking is the extent to which the two sides in the debate were operating with conflicting narratives about the meaning of Brexit, conflicting narratives about the United Kingdom and its place in the world, conflicting narratives about British history and British identity. And it was a fact that they had conflicting narratives that was really the crux of the disagreement between the two sides in the debate. And you can't even begin, I think, to understand the way that the Brexit debate went without understanding these underlying narratives. Now, of course, there is perhaps a mythical element to these narratives on both sides. So, of course, on the pro-Brexit side, there was a narrative about British greatness and British independence and British ingenuity and all that stuff that we've all heard of. It may all be a lot of rubbish, but nevertheless, it constituted a compelling narrative, I think, for many voters. And I think it also explains why talking to voters about the economic impact of Brexit wasn't really particularly effective as a means of convincing them not to vote for Brexit, because given the underlying narrative of Britishness and Britain's place in the world, none of that really seemed to matter. The second thing that I want to emphasize is that narratives are themselves exercises in sense making. Okay, so when you try to reconstruct another person's narrative, what you're really doing is you're trying to reconstruct the other person's own sense making. So narratives are the ways that people try to make sense of the world. So when you try to make sense of another person's narrative, you are engaging in sense making of sense making. Okay, so I think that's a very important point to notice. I mean, narratives are not just stories, right? They are not just nice and seductive stories. They are themselves attempts to make sense of the world. And of course, again, you see that in the case of conspiracy theories, which are in their own perverse way attempts to make sense of complex political events. I also want to draw attention to something else, which I hope is kind of obvious, which is that in narrative reconstruction, in attempting to reconstruct or uncover someone else's narrative, there is no assumption that the reconstructive narratives are true. You certainly don't need to make that assumption. I mean, charity in that sense is not required. Right? So in trying to reconstruct the Brexiters' narrative, I don't need to assume that their narrative is correct. In trying to reconstruct the Trumpian narrative, I don't need to assume that their narrative is correct. I mean, of course, in the case of many of these narratives are much closer to myths than scientific theories. Nevertheless, they are themselves exercises in sense making. And what we're really trying to do is to establish an intelligible link, a connection between a person's narrative and what they do. And so it's not, I mean, there may be a causal connection, but what I'm suggesting is that it's people's narratives that make sense of their actions. Okay, so here's a kind of a practical example of this. and I'm going back to the case of the US. So I think that one thing that I feel quite strongly now is that when one's talking about political developments in the States in the last few years, what we've been witnessing is effectively a form of radicalization. What's happened is that the Republican Party in the US has essentially been radicalized. We've heard a lot about radicalization in the context of terrorism and the Muslim world, and that's a different kind of radicalization. But I think it's helpful to think about radicalization also in this US context. And if you think about the narratives that underpin this radicalization, so-called radicalization narratives, I think these include, of course, conspiracy theories, as well as myths about class, race, and history. Of course, there are also more mundane narratives about the election being stolen, and the elite trying to stymie Trump and his supporters. So I think that part of what's been going on in the US has been the increasing influence of what I think of as radicalization narratives, narratives that are effective in radicalizing sections of the population. Now, these narratives in this particular example, the narratives that have influenced, for example, the people who stormed the Capitol, these narratives, I would say, are complete fabrications. Nevertheless, they provide their adherents with cognitive satisfaction, the feeling that now they understand. And also, these narratives draw on aspects of people's lived experience. It's important that even if these narratives are not true, they have what I call the ring of truth. The ring of truth from the perspective of those to whom they are addressed. So bizarre as this might seem to us, many of these Trumpian narratives were as effective as they have been as effective as they have been in radicalizing sections of the Republican Party, is that from the perspective of their Republican audiences, these narratives have a ring of truth. They seem plausible, they seem compelling. And that is perfectly consistent with also accepting that, in fact, these narratives are a tissue of falsehoods. And the last point I want to make about these narratives is that they are action guiding. They are action guiding and I think account for the recent turn to political violence in the United States and perhaps elsewhere. That's what I mean when I say that these are radicalization narratives. Okay, so that's the proposal. That's the proposal. Sense making is important. Sense making is something that we should do, and part of sense making is reconstructing the narratives that underpin otherwise strange seeming political actions and choices. The last thing I want to talk about, which I'll talk about only because I want to wind up in a couple of minutes, is the question: what are the so are there political actors and political narratives that are simply beyond the reach of sense making? Okay, so certainly if you're thinking about a political actor who seems to be in some sense beyond the reach of sense making, you might think of Trump himself, someone who is in a way kind of deeply unfathomable. I mean, maybe in the case of someone like him, sense making is going to be of limited effectiveness. I think it's a good question whether that's true or not, but in any case, that's one possible problem. Or if you think about certain political narratives, if you think about the QAnon narrative in the US, I mean, what hope is there of making sense of that? I mean, the thing seems so utterly absurd. It seems almost incomprehensible that somebody could take QAnon conspiracy theory seriously. Well, that might all be true, but the question is, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? I don't really see what the alternative is, and I suspect that talk of the impossibility of sense making in these cases is somewhat exaggerated, and that this is something we might want to discuss. The other point about sense making that you might want to raise is that Well, surely there are some cases where we just shouldn't engage in sense making, where sense making becomes a form of complicity with repellent ideologies. I mean, where does sense making end? I mean, you've got Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. So where does it end? I mean, should we be engaging in sense making of the Ku Klux Klan? What about the Nazis? Right. So there is the question of, well, I mean, surely there are cases where we are dealing with people or with preferences or with choices that actually really are beyond the pale, and where it's morally suspect to engage in sense making. Now, I completely see the force of that. I completely see the force of that. But I think that even in these extreme cases, there is a pragmatic argument for engaging in sense making, if only to develop counter strategies or de-radicalization or counter-radicalization strategies. You need to know where people are coming from in order to know how to respond to them and how to deal with them. Okay, so that's the last slide now. So I want to say that sense making is not an end in itself. It should be a precursor to a program of de-radicalization. And de-radicalization, I think, is enabled by the development of effective counter-narratives to radicalization narratives. So insofar as the Trumpians have their own narrative, what we need is to develop an effective counter-narrative. And an effective counter-narrative is one that resonates with its audience. And there are a series of features that effective counter-narratives need to have, one of which is, of course, the ring of truth. I think it's very important that one's counter-narratives have what someone called narrative fidelity, if they're to be at all convincing. Okay, so I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think we can open the floor to questions. Raise hands via the hand raise function. Okay, I can't raise my hand as I'm the co-host. So Professor, I would thank you for your talk. I would like to start with a question. Mm-hmm. So what comes after sense making? So let's assume that I completely understand where certain groups, say, for example, the alternative right in the United States is coming from. Let's say I understand how they perceive their class. Let's say I understand how they feel alienated from political decision making and from the rest of society. I understand how they form clusters on online forums such as 4chan. And let's assume that given that I've made sense of their narrative, that I can engage in deliberation with them, but they still cannot engage in deliberation with me. They distrust me because they are in an echo chamber. What happens then?
So I think that's a kind of complicated question. So one thing that I feel is very important in their narratives is that their narratives are essentially narratives of grievance. So part of sense making is going to be the uncovering, the surfacing of the grievances that their narratives exploit. Now, having done that, of course, then the further question that needs to be asked is, are any of these grievances genuine? Now, in the case of genuine grievances, so for example, grievances that that pick up on problems of, say, for example, marginalization or disenfranchisement, in the case of genuine grievances, they need to be addressed in policy terms. In the case of grievances that are essentially mythical, what comes next is the development of counter-narratives. And the point of counter-narratives is not just or not even primarily to convert the true believers on the other side to one's own cause. The real point of these narratives, counter-narratives, I think, is to prevent others from being drawn into these alt-right extremist perspectives. So if you so you can think about the distinction between counter-radicalization and de-radicalization. So de-radicalization would mean actually changing the minds of one's political opponents. Counter-radicalization would involve actually trying to prevent others from joining their side of the debate. And that really means developing persuasive counter-narratives and addressing any genuine grievances that there are, and developing political strategies that are informed by one's sense making. So I think I certainly don't think of sense making as, you know, an end in itself, as just a theoretical project. I think of sense making, as I think I said on one of the slides, as a precursor to the development of practical strategies for what I would call counter-radicalization.
Thank you, thank you. Then I would like to give the podium to Michael Hannon.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for this talk. It was really fascinating. I think I'm convinced by everything you've said. I think one of the things that's nice about your view over the empathy view is that the worry with empathy is that you start to maybe feel tempted by the view. You see truth in it, and that might lead to kind of worries about the moral question of the agent who's empathizing, whereas yours doesn't run into that worry. I just wanted to ask about getting a bit clearer on the shape of these narratives. So some questions were just things like, you know, you'd mentioned that you don't need to assume that the narrative's true, and that of course seems right. But I was wondering whether or not when we give these narratives, if it's the kind of thing that our opponents have to endorse as a true description of the way they see the world, like is it true to them when we describe it? And I guess relatedly, I'm just worried about cases, I guess, where maybe there is no kind of fixed, clear narrative. People have like a general disinclination towards certain ways of, you know, orienting yourself in politics. And so there might be a number of different and incompatible descriptions that they would accept under different, like in different contexts maybe. And so I was wondering about people without like fixed narratives. They just have a kind of just general negative or positive orientation towards certain things. Whether those kinds of cases worry you at all?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So on the first question, the first question I think is whether the narrative that you reconstruct needs to be recognizable by the people concerned as their narrative. And I would say that it does. I mean, if you say that this is their underlying narrative, but they don't recognize it as their narrative, that is at least prima facie difficulty with your position. I mean, they may not recognize it in the terms, using the terminology that you use, but it's got to at least in some way connect with their explicit and perhaps implicit beliefs and attitudes. And I don't think that, you know, narrative reconstruction in this sense is particularly difficult or particularly tricky. I mean, it's actually quite easy to reconstruct the narrative of the alt-right in the US and elsewhere. Your second question, I think, is really a really challenging and really fascinating question. So this is the idea that, you know, maybe what we're dealing with is a kind of orientation to political reality that isn't underpinned by anything that's recognizable as a narrative or a story about how different things fit together. That would be, I think, a difficulty for my view if I thought that was a common phenomenon. I find it hard to believe that it is that common. I think that in many cases, what you have is people whose narratives are not articulated by them, but nevertheless there is a narrative, and which, if properly articulated, would be recognizable by them as their narrative. I mean, if you think about you know, the far right in the US, you know, so what is the narrative, right? Well, you know, so there's a narrative about the federal government want to take our guns, white people are being oppressed by black people, the American there are too many immigrants. I mean, you know, these are all familiar aspects of the, you know, of the narrative. And you know, the genius of Trump in 2016 was that he both appealed to that narrative and articulated it himself, right? and strengthened and radicalized the narrative. And that, I think, was, you know, a classic example of a kind of, you know, an intuitive political operator who understood the importance of, as it were, surfacing narratives that may not have been articulated by the people whose narratives they were. That's why stuff like, you know, Drain the Swamp was so powerful, because it appealed to a sort of implicit narrative of Trump's audience. So I think that's how I would want to respond to your questions. And I mean, I certainly see my view about these things as consistent with many things that you've said in your writings, Michael. So I think we're on the same side here.
Thank you. Great.
I would just like to use this opportunity to welcome Professor Alpstrom V, who's joined us. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to give the floor to Snezhna Pritsomazhia for her question.
Thank you, Professor Cassam. Very interesting, extremely interesting and inspiring lecture. I'm very much sympathizing with your idea about sense making, but I'm just wondering, it actually reminds me this reconstruction of narratives on the Rorty's advice to develop, that epistemology actually need to concentrate to conversational practices. So what we actually need to reconstruct social history of beliefs, of stances, and I'm just wondering about your opinion, whether we need, for instance, just to reconstruct the narrative to understand, the others, or you would like to suggest to us that actually we need to take their stances epistemically seriously as the epistemically responsible, let us say, stances, because it seems to me that this kind of ignorance truth or something like that could be very dangerous for, let us say, some idea of objective epistemic value of the quality of our final decisions if we take such an, let us say, beliefs as our stances as a real, arguments need to be taken seriously. So thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I mean, what I would say is that it's not just a matter of making sense of their sense making. I think the most compelling form of sense making is going to be a form of sense making that relates other people's narratives to their lived experience. Now, that isn't to say, that their narratives are thereby flagged as epistemically justified or as true, but it is to say that other people's narratives have to be intelligible to us as their narratives in the light of other aspects of their lives. And I think that the notion of lived experience is very interesting notion in this capacity. That I think that it's certainly in the case of some alt-right narratives in the US, these narratives are at least intelligible in the light of aspects of their lived experience. That their experience, for example, of globalization and the impact of globalization on their lives. So I don't see that as a matter of, well, we're talking about narratives that are epistemically justified, or that we have to think of as epistemically justified or as true, but justified in some other sense. I mean, as to say, they make a certain kind of sense in the light of aspects of their lives, and I think that's rather important. They can't. I mean, you could have narratives that are just fantasies, but narratives that aren't just fantasies, narratives that connect with people's lives are much more compelling and much more powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Just a small, if I may, Hannah. Yeah, but in democratic decision making, for instance, I'm just wondering, about you're talking about the limits of sense making, but I'm just thinking how we can, take their stances and the very precise, practical thinking, as the relevant, concerning the epistemic quality of their idea.
So the question is whether we should be taking their stories as relevant as things that we need to respond to in democratic decision making. Is that the question?
Yeah. In deliberation, for instance, some ideal situation, how we actually are obliged, to take them seriously, epistemically seriously, in this democratic decision making. We understand them, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that question. So let's think of a practical example, right? So think about the views that many people in Europe and North America have about immigration, right? So I mean, so their narrative is that globalization and free movement has generated immigration that has taken away their jobs, reduced, added strain on public services, and diminished the quality of their lives. And that's why they don't want more immigration. That's why they want tighter immigration controls. Now, I mean, I think it's a really tough question what we do about that, right? Because you might think, well, there's something in their lived experience that makes that an intelligible narrative. But the question that remains is the question that you're asking, which is, well, what weight should we be attaching to their preferences ultimately when deciding whether you should have tighter immigration controls or not? And I think, I mean, this is really difficult, right? Because as someone who actually is completely in favor of free movement, I think the problem with simply saying to people who want tighter immigration controls, you're just wrong, we're not going to pay any attention to your views, is that you then get this buildup of populist resentment, which eventually comes out, in all sorts of unfortunate ways further down the line. So, I mean, unfortunately, I think in a democracy, I think some of these preferences do need to be taken seriously in political decision making, including preferences that we might, one might oneself find regrettable. I mean, there's a line to be drawn, but I think that must be the case.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Professor Baccarini asked me to pose a question without the hand raised, so the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you very much, Professor Cassam, for your excellent talk. I would like just to express a worry about whether focusing on narratives is the best way to make sense, or it would be better, or at least sometimes needed, to focus more on something that is hidden. So I would like just very briefly to speak about one of the classical examples is fascism, which is in some sense the archetype of everything that followed in the 12th century. And after World War I, there were two big troubles for the nation. One is the one visible and expressed in the narrative. It's the narrative of the mutilated victory, of coming out officially as one of the victorious states from World War I, nonetheless not getting the results of the victory, which was the official rhetoric, which, however, is a little bit strange, because I guess that if we make statistics in the Italian nation, there will not be really so much people worrying about losing Rijeka and Dalmatia. On the other hand, there was this enormous economic crisis, all these soldiers coming home and without, with existential conditions for their families really compromised. And one possibility is that, in fact, the real problem is that one, not the one that appeared in the narrative. So, there was another narrative of social rights strikes, but not related to this. In a sense, when we explain fascism, it seems that at least one very important component, if not the crucial component, was the hidden one. So here is my question, how this fits with your picture of highlighting the importance of narratives to make sense of such phenomena like fascism.
Yeah. So supposing you have the following story, right? So you have on the one hand the myth or narrative of the stab in the back in Germany, for example, in the interwar years, and then you have the economic reality of Germany in the interwar years. So you have both sorts of consideration are going to be highly influential in people's political decision making. I completely agree with that, and so I wouldn't say that I'm proposing narratives to the exclusion of the other things that you're mentioning. But what I would say is that even when you're looking at, as it were, the economic realities and people's quality of life and so on, and the impact of those things on their political judgments and preferences, I think it's quite often the case that even those sorts of sort of, ground level economic realities, they're influential because when mediated by a narrative, because there's a narrative about why things are as they are, why people's circumstances are as they are, and it's when you have this sort of conjunction of as it were, the realities of their lives with a certain attempt to make sense of those realities, that you have a really lethal and toxic combination. But on the broader point, I guess I'm not at all suggesting that narrative reconstruction is all there is to it, and it's the only thing that we should be doing. I mean, I'm completely open to there being a lot of other considerations that we should be taking into account. I just want to highlight one consideration that I think has been, rather neglected in discussions of these matters: the extent to which we are human beings are beings who tell stories. I think that's just a fundamental human thing. We tell stories about ourselves, about the world that we live in, and we use those stories to explain and justify what we do, and that is at least as important as anything else that has been mentioned in this context.
Thank you very much. Fabienne, the floor is yours. Sorry for the wait.
Okay, sorry, I'd had problems unmuting myself. Thank you, Hannah, and thanks, Quassim. I really enjoyed your talk. And so my question is really follows up nicely from Snežana's and Elio's. It's not to question anything you're saying, but to suggest an additional avenue. So you focused on prudential reasons and ethical reasons for sense making, and narratives fit nicely with that focus. I completely agree. But I'm wondering whether there are also epistemic reasons for sense making in a political context, for the following reason. When we engage in politics, we're making claims about how we should live together. So you're making claims on behalf of the collective. But if you lack a grasp of where others are coming from, and we're not just talking about individual others, but millions of potentially others, right? And you don't, as you put it, you have a blind spot there with regard to where they're coming from. In a way, you're making claims without knowing what you're talking about, right? So you're epistemically deficient in your political contributions. So there could be epistemic pressures on you on trying to understand where those who disagree with you are coming from. And perhaps if we're thinking along those lines, then there are also sort of more strongly epistemic channels that might be needed to rectify and to compensate for that deficit that you're having.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's a really helpful addition. I mean, I think of sense making as a kind of epistemic activity in the sense that it's about understanding, and understanding is about knowing, and it's a form of knowing that we, as you just pointed out, that we actually need in order to develop epistemically well-grounded policies. So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that's I think a very helpful kind of thing to bring out. So if I would, in the light of what you're saying, if I were doing that slide again, I would have pragmatic, ethical, and epistemic. I think that's a helpful addition. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Professor Berčić has asked me for a word.
You're on mute. You're still on.
You're muted. I'll just unmute you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. So, Professor Cassam, I love your lecture. This is the right point. So, somewhere in the middle of presentation, you had a slide. You were mentioning emotions and emotional empathy or emotional understanding. So, if I get it right, you sort of dismissed that in favor of reasons. Well, so I have one maybe counter example. Say, in Croatia, we have democracy. We have elections for 31 years now. And in my opinion, the results of the outcomes of these elections can and should be rather explained in terms of emotions. Yeah. Unfortunately, bad emotions like hatred, fear, frustration, and so. And then these results make sense. If you try to explain these results in terms of reasons, they make absolutely no sense. So maybe in some context, maybe some collective frustration or something is better explanation than reason giving.
Yes, right. So, so I think what I want to say there is completely to agree with you about the importance of emotions as political drivers. But I think what I was saying was that there are two different ways in which we can attempt to actually figure out what these emotions are. One is via emotional empathy, and the other is via cognitive empathy. Now, emotional empathy would mean here's a concrete example, right? So I think it's probably true in the UK that there's a certain kind of white voter who has emotions of hostility and revulsion towards Muslims on the street dressed in hijabs and so on. Now, emotional empathy as a method of grasping this emotion would require me to, as it were, somehow put myself into their shoes in such a way as to feel their revulsion at the sight of a Muslim. Well, I can't do that, I'm afraid. I'm simply not capable of engaging in that kind of emotional empathy with that sort of racist response to people from other races. I mean, I'm a Muslim, right? So I'm not going to. It's very difficult for me to kind of put myself in the shoes of a white person who finds the very sight of someone in Muslim dress repellent. Right? But nevertheless, of course, I completely see that sort of emotion might be playing a big role in their political decision making. And what's more, I can grasp the fact that that emotion is important to them by engaging in cognitive empathy without engaging in without any emotional empathy, right? So in a certain sense, I can't empathize at all with their emotions, but I can nevertheless grasp that those are their emotions, and that those emotions of theirs are playing a role in their political decision making. So I think what you're picking up on was a certain lack of clarity in my presentation. So I can see that, you know, it might have sounded as if I was saying emotions aren't important in people's political decision making, and as you pointed out, I mean, that's just false. It is important. So it was more drawing attention to the limitations in emotional empathy as a means of tracking other people's emotions.
Thanks.
Okay, I would like to give the floor to Robert Raus. I'll unmute you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for your talk, Professor. My question is very similar to that of Professor Pertic. I have it written down. So my question relates to the distinction between emotional and cognitive empathy. You seem to characterize emotional empathy as secondary to cognitive empathy when it comes to sense making. However, in terms of creating viable counter-narratives, is cognitive empathy truly more important, given that political radicals aren't really sympathetic to logically consistent arguments, whereas they seem to be more sympathetic to arguments that acknowledge their feelings of being threatened, feelings of being left behind, or feelings of alienation? So my question in particular relates to how can we do a better job of integrating emotional empathy into our counter-narratives in the hopes of de-radicalizing people who are, supposedly beyond the pale?
Yes, that's a tough question. So I think it's perfectly true that an effective counter-narrative is one that will have emotional punch to it. That is to say, one that will influence the audience's emotions and not just their abstract thinking. However, I think it doesn't follow from that the construction of effective narratives requires emotional empathy with other people's emotions. It requires a grasp of what those emotions are and a grasp of their influence. And it requires the construction of a story that is going to be effective relative to those emotions. But that's still not the same as saying that sense making is itself dependent on or requires emotional empathy. I mean, there may be cases where emotional empathy is possible, and in those cases, there's no reason not to, not to have it. But there are also going to be cases where emotional empathy is very difficult. You know, so I mean, as I say, I think it's very difficult for me to have much emotional empathy with you know, the pro-gun tattooed Trump supporter, you know, shouting lock her up or whatever it was back in 2016. I mean, I don't have any emotional empathy for those guys at all, right? But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that I can't you know, that I can't understand what's driving them. I can't understand that they're, you know, the extent to which they're moved by feelings of resentment and so on. And it also doesn't mean that I can't then set about the task of constructing counter narratives to their, you know, to their narratives. So I think there are two different places in which emotional empathy can, you know, can come in. And I don't, I mean, in fact, it doesn't seem to me to be essential in either case.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you. Professor Thorpe, would you like to pose your question?
Hi, yeah, sorry I'm not got my video on. I've got problems with bandwidth. I've got a question about the limits of sense making. And in particular, I think that sense making often transforms anger into pity. And so I suspect that what one thinks about the value of sense making is going to depend upon the value or the disvalue one puts on anger in politics. And so, for example, now I think many people in America think the appropriate response that may play a role in counter-radicalization is an expression of anger and the appropriate punishment that goes with it. And maybe sense-making kind of is going to kind of lead to this type of pity. And pity, you may think, is actually more disrespectful than anger, these sort of Rousseauian ideas, that pity really involves quite deep condensation. So why not anger rather than pity? And I think in terms of counter-radicalization, there may be benefits and disbenefits on both sides.
Yeah, so one question I think that raises is whether pity is really going to be the result of sense making. Now, the way I was understanding sense making, I don't see that as integral to sense making or a necessary or even likely consequence of it. I think my worry about sense making is not so much, you know, pity, but you know, the risk of as it were, excessive sympathy for the targets of one's sense making. So I'd certainly want to kind of raise a question about whether, you know, whether sense making leads to pity or not. And perhaps that's one difference between us on the role of anger. I mean, well, I don't know how constructive that is actually as a political tool or a political methodology. I mean, of course one feels, you know, one feels tremendous anger towards you know, towards you know, the Trumpians in the States and the far right generally, and one expresses one's anger. But I think one's got to get, you know, beyond that to a political strategy that's designed to address these positions, and anger I don't think is going to be very effective as a means of doing that. There has to be some mode of engagement which goes beyond that. So I think, you know, neither anger nor pity is actually going to be very helpful in this context.
Thank you so much. Professor Caranti, I would just have to ask you to be brief since we need to have the next session.
Very brief, don't worry. Yes, I have a question about the limits of sense making. I may have missed some of the things you said during the presentation, because I do remember that you correctly pointed out that something must be said about the limits of sense making. Now, so this connects to the preceding question. What are the limits of sense making? I mean, is there a political ideology of which we cannot make sense? I don't think so. I mean, can we make sense of the Nazi ideology? Sure. I mean, if you really believe that, you know, Juden sind unsere Unglück and they are Untermenschen, of course you are going to understand some of the things that happened. So my impression is that you can make sense pretty much of everything on the political spectrum. Yeah. And if that is the case, I wonder what can we do with this notion of sense making? If it applies to everything, in what sense that becomes useful?
Yeah.
Also as a strategy of deradicalization. I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I think I agree. I think I agree with you that you can make some kind of sense even of the most extreme ideologies. So the question then is, A, what are the limits that I'm talking about? And B, what's the point? What's the use of sense making? So on the limits, of course, somebody might think it's not that you can't embark on the project of trying to make sense of Nazi ideology. Some people might want to say it's more that you shouldn't, you ought not to. And so it's an expression of one's revulsion of this ideology is a refusal to engage with it in the sort of sense-making mode. Now, so that would be the sort of ethical argument against engaging in sense-making in these contexts, which is not to say that you couldn't do it. It's just to say you shouldn't do it. My own kind of view is that, well, I think that even in that case, there are still good pragmatic reasons for doing it. And the pragmatic reason for doing it is the answer to your second question, which is what's the point of doing it, which is that unless you do it, you're not going to be able to develop effective counter messages, effective counter strategies. I mean, you need to figure out what is it? I mean, we're not talking about the Nazi leadership, but you're just thinking about members of the general population who are maybe not yet true believers, but who are tempted by this ideology. You need to have a story to tell that is going to pull them away from this. And the starting point for that is to understand what is moving them, what's the big draw for them in the first place.
Thanks so much to all of you.